Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've been hauling freight across Wyoming for about 15 years now, and nothing quite prepared me for what happened that October night in 2018. At the time, I was 38, divorced, living in a small apartment in Casper when I wasn't on the road. Most weeks I'd be gone Monday through Friday, sometimes longer if the money was good. That particular week, I was running a load of automotive parts from Denver up to Billings, a route I'd done probably 100 times before. The weather forecast showed possible fog around the mountain passes, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I'd left Denver around 6 in the evening, figuring I'd push through the night and make Billings by morning. My rig was a 2015 Peterbilt, dark blue with chrome details, and I kept her in pristine condition. She was basically my second home. The fog rolled in around 11 p.m., just past mile marker 187 on I-25, way thicker than anything the Weather Service had predicted. Within minutes, visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it was like driving through cotton. I slowed down to about 35, hazards on, white-knuckling the steering wheel while trying to stay centered in my lane. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and wisps of fog kept swirling across my headlights like ghostly fingers. My CB radio had been quiet for the last hour. Most truckers had probably pulled off to wait it out, but I was already behind schedule and couldn't afford to stop. The only sounds were the rumble of my diesel engine and the occasional static burst from the radio. That stretch of I-25 is pretty desolate even on clear nights, just endless darkness punctuated by the occasional ranch light in the distance. But that night it felt like driving through a void. Around 11:30, my CB crackled to life with a voice I'll never forget. Gravelly, tired sounding, with this odd wheeze between words like the guy was a heavy smoker or had some kind of respiratory issue. "Breaker, breaker, this is Steel Horse calling northbound traffic near 187. Got ourselves a real soup out here tonight, don't we?" The way he pronounced certain words was peculiar, dropping the G sounds and stretching his vowels in this distinctive drawl that seemed more southern than Wyoming. I grabbed my handset, grateful to hear another human voice in all that isolation. "Steel Horse, this is Big Blue northbound at 189. Copy you loud and clear. Yeah, this fog came out of nowhere. You parked or still rolling?" There was a pause, maybe 3 or 4 seconds before he came back on. "Still rolling, friend. Moving real careful like through 192 now. Hey, you might want to know there's a jackknifed rig up ahead around 195, blocking most of the right lane. Happened maybe 20 minutes ago. That information probably saved my life, or at least saved me from a serious accident." I thanked him and asked if anyone was hurt, and he said he didn't think so, but the fog was too thick to tell for sure. We kept talking as I drove, and something about his voice was oddly comforting in that oppressive darkness. He told me he'd been driving this route since 1982, knew every curve and grade change by heart. Said he was hauling a load of lumber up to Sheridan, driving an old Kenworth W900 that he'd rebuilt himself 3 times over the years. The details he gave were incredibly specific. Mentioned the custom leather seats he'd installed, the chrome Peterbilt-style air cleaners he'd retrofitted, even the faded Leonard Sky Nerd sticker on his back window. Every few minutes, he'd give me updates on road conditions ahead, warning me about patches where the fog was thicker, where the road curved sharply, where there might be ice forming. When I reached mile marker 195, sure enough, there was the jackknife truck exactly where he'd said it would be. A red Freightliner twisted across the highway with its trailer at a 45-degree angle, hazard lights blinking weakly through the fog. I eased past it in the left lane, barely squeezing through, and told Steel Horse I'd made it safely around. "That's good to hear, Big Blue. Real good to hear. Gets hairy through there even on a clear night. Say you might want to ease off your speed coming up on 198. There's a nasty dip there that'll bounce you good if you hit it too fast. Learned that the hard way back in '97, cracked 2-leaf springs and spent 3 days waiting for parts in Cheyenne. His knowledge of the road was encyclopedic, and I found myself trusting him completely. He'd mention landmarks I couldn't see in the fog, but would catch glimpses of seconds later. An old billboard for a defunct truck stop, a yellow highway sign with a bullet hole through the middle, a cluster of 3 dead trees that locals called the witch's fingers, though he assured me that was just trucker folklore. We talked for nearly an hour as I crawled through that fog, and he shared stories about his years on the road. He mentioned his wife, Dorothy, who'd passed from lung cancer in 2008, and how he'd started taking longer hauls after that because the empty house drove him crazy. Told me about his daughter who lived in Colorado Springs, a nurse at Memorial Hospital, and his 2 grandsons who were both in high school now. The way he talked about them was so genuine, so detailed. Mentioned the older one played trumpet in the school band. The younger one was obsessed with rebuilding old motorcycles in their garage. He even laughed about how his daughter kept trying to get him to retire, move closer to them, but he said the road was all he knew anymore. At one point, he started coughing badly over the radio, this wet, rattling sound that went on for maybe 30 seconds before he came back on, apologizing and blaming it on 40 years of Marlboro Reds. By the time I passed mile marker 210, the fog had started to thin out a bit, and I could finally see more than 50 feet ahead. Steelhorse told me he was pulling off at the truck stop near exit 213, said his eyes weren't what they used to be, and he needed to rest them for a few hours. Been good talking with you, Big Blue. You drive safe now and watch yourself through that stretch near Casper. Weather's supposed to clear up by dawn. I thanked him for all his help, told him I owed him a beer if we ever crossed paths, and he laughed. This warm, genuine laugh that turned into another coughing fit. I'll hold you to that, friend. Steelhorse signing off. The radio went quiet after that, just static and the occasional distant chatter from other truckers far ahead or behind me. I kept thinking about our conversation as I drove, how lucky I'd been to have someone guiding me through the worst of it. The man had probably kept me from rear-ending that jackknife truck or worse. I made it to Billings around 7 the next morning, exhausted but grateful to be done with that haul. After unloading and grabbing breakfast at a Flying J, I called my dispatcher to report the conditions and mentioned the accident near mile marker 195. He put me on hold for a few minutes, then came back sounding confused. Jake, I just checked with Wyoming Highway Patrol. They don't have any reports of a jackknifed truck at that location last night. You sure about the mile marker? I was absolutely certain. I'd seen it clear as day, even took a mental note of the company name on the trailer, Riverside Logistics out of Salt Lake City. My dispatcher said he'd check again and get back to me. Meanwhile, I started asking around the truck stop if anyone else had heard Steelhorse on the CB last night. Most guys shook their heads, but one old-timer, must have been 70 at least, went pale when I mentioned the handle. The old guy, introduced himself as Carl, pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the diner and asked me to describe the voice I'd heard. When I mentioned the wheeze, the southern drawl, the coughing fits, he gripped his coffee cup so tight I thought it might shatter. Son, I need you to tell me exactly where you were when you talked to him. What mile markers? I told him everything. The conversation starting near 187, the jackknife truck at 195, him signing off at 213. Carl stared at me for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and showed me a news article from 2014. The headline read, "Veteran Trucker Found Murdered at Rest Stop." The victim's name was Harold Brewster, but the article mentioned he went by Steelhorse on the CB. He'd been beaten to death during a robbery at the rest area near mile marker 195, the exact spot where I'd seen that jackknife truck. The article included a photo, a heavy-set man in his 60s with a graying beard, standing next to a burgundy Kenworth W900. Carl said he'd known Harold for 20 years, said the man had died of massive head trauma, but the killers also crushed his throat, which explained the wheeze I'd heard. What really made my gut twist into knots was when Carl told me about Harold's family. His wife Dorothy had indeed died of lung cancer, but in 2010, not 2008. His daughter was a nurse in Colorado Springs, and she did have 2 sons. The details were all accurate but slightly off. like someone recounting memories through a foggy glass. Carl said Harold had been a chain smoker, Marlboro Reds specifically, and knew that stretch of I-25 better than anyone. "Here's the thing that'll really mess with your head," Carl said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Every couple of years, someone comes through here with the same story. Always during heavy fog, always that same stretch of road, always helping them avoid some accident that nobody else can verify. Highway Patrol thinks it's truckers playing pranks, copying the story. But those of us who knew Harold," he trailed off, shaking his head. Then he told me something that made me feel sick. They'd found Harold's CB radio smashed at the scene, but when they'd recovered his truck from impound a week later, someone had been broadcasting on his frequency, using his handle, giving traffic updates that turned out to be accurate. I spent the next 3 hours on the phone with Wyoming Highway Patrol, trying to make sense of what had happened. The officer I spoke with, a Sergeant Holloway, was professional but clearly skeptical. He confirmed that Harold Brewster had been murdered at that rest area in 2014, and yes, there had been reports over the years of someone using his CB handle during foggy conditions. When I insisted about the jackknife truck, he had me describe it in detail: the red Freightliner, the Riverside logistics trailer, the exact position across the highway. He put me on hold for nearly 20 minutes, and when he came back, his tone had changed completely. "Mr. Morrison, we just pulled surveillance footage from a traffic camera at mile marker 194. There's no truck there, hasn't been all night. But," he paused, and I could hear papers shuffling. "In 2014, the night Harold Brewster was killed, there was a jackknife truck at that exact location. Red Freightliner, Riverside Logistics. Driver walked away uninjured, but it took 6 hours to clear the scene. Harold had stopped to help redirect traffic around it when he was attacked. The sergeant asked if I'd been drinking, taking any medication, if I was tired. I understood his skepticism, but I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The part that haunts me most came when Sergeant Holloway checked the radio logs. The FBI had been involved in the original murder investigation because it crossed state lines, and they'd monitored CB frequencies in that area for months afterward, trying to catch the killers. He said their equipment showed anomalous broadcasts on Channel 19 last night, precisely matching the times I'd claimed to be talking with Steelhorse. The transmission source couldn't be triangulated. It seemed to originate from multiple points along the highway simultaneously, which was technically impossible. But the audio was there, recorded on their automated systems. They even played back a fragment for me over the phone, and hearing that wheezing voice again made me physically ill. The sergeant said they'd had 5 similar incidents since 2014, always during heavy fog, always with truckers who'd never heard the original story. Each time, the phantom broadcasts had helped drivers avoid real hazards, black ice, debris, disabled vehicles, that appeared on that stretch shortly after the warnings were given. They'd investigated extensively, thinking someone was playing an elaborate hoax, but could never find a source. The FBI tech specialist said the broadcasts showed characteristics of old analog equipment, specifically a Cobra 29 LTD Classic from the early 1980s, the exact model Harold had been using, which was destroyed at the crime scene. I never drove that stretch of I-25 at night again. Changed my routes, took the financial hit, didn't care what dispatch thought about it. But I did some research on my own, spent weeks going through old forums, police reports, newspaper archives. Found out that Harold's killers were never caught, though there'd been 2 suspects, drifters who'd been robbing truckers along that corridor. Both died in a car accident near mile marker 195 in 2016, their vehicle sliding off the road during a fog similar to the one I'd driven through. No other vehicles involved, no explanation for why they'd lost control. The accident report noted that several truckers had called in warnings about erratic driving from that vehicle minutes before it crashed, but the callers had all used different handles, and none could be traced. I also learned that Harold's daughter had tried for years to get a memorial marker placed at mile marker 195, but the state kept denying the request due to safety concerns about drivers stopping on that dangerous stretch. She finally gave up in 2017, the same year the mysterious broadcasts became more frequent. I'm sharing this story because I need people to understand that I'm not crazy, that something inexplicable happened that night. Maybe it was someone with sophisticated equipment playing an elaborate game. Maybe there's a technical explanation for those impossible broadcasts. But I know what I experienced, and I know that voice saved me from hitting that jackknife truck, even if that truck existed in some other time. Carl, the old-timer from the truck stop, called me a few months later to say another driver had come through with an almost identical story. This time, Steelhorse had warned about a chemical spill that hadn't happened yet, but occurred 2 hours later exactly where he'd said. The driver had already rerouted, avoiding a 5-hour hazmat shutdown. The highway patrol doesn't investigate these incidents anymore. They just log them and move on. Some truckers now consider it good luck to hear Steelhorse on foggy nights through that stretch, say it means you'll make it through safely. Others change their routes like I did. All I know is that Harold Brewster was a good man who died trying to help another driver, and maybe, somehow, he's still out there doing exactly that. I don't need to understand it. I'm just grateful that on the worst night of driving in my career, someone was watching out for me, even if that someone had been dead for 4 years. The fog that night was unlike anything I'd seen in 15 years of driving truck through Illinois. Thick as milk, rolling across Interstate 55 in waves that made the asphalt disappear and reappear like some kind of magic trick. Around 2:30 a.m., somewhere between Bloomington and Springfield, I was pushing my Peterbilt through that soup, hauling 40,000 pounds of automotive parts that needed to be in St. Louis by sunrise. The CB radio had gone quiet an hour earlier. Not even the usual chatter from other night drivers, just static and the occasional crackle when I passed under power lines. My dashboard clock glowed green in the darkness, and I kept checking it because time felt strange in that fog, like minutes were stretching into hours. The heater was blowing full blast but couldn't seem to cut through the damp cold that had settled into the cab. It was 2:40 a.m. exactly when I saw her on the Riverside Road overpass. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut, because nobody, and I mean nobody, stands on an overpass at that hour, unless they're planning something terrible. She was wearing what looked like a white nightgown or maybe a hospital gown, the thin fabric whipping around her legs, even though the air outside was dead still. Her hands gripped the concrete barrier, knuckles visible even from my distance, and she was leaning forward at this awful angle, staring straight down at the highway. But here's what made my throat go dry. She wasn't looking at the road in general. She was looking at my truck specifically, her head turning slowly to track me as I approached. Her hair hung in wet, dark strands that didn't move with the rest of her, like it was weighted down with something, and her face was tilted at such an extreme angle that all I could see was the pale curve of her forehead and the dark hollows where her eyes should be. I passed under that overpass doing about 65, and I swear I felt the temperature drop 20 degrees the second I went beneath her. My ears popped like I'd changed altitude, and this smell filled the cab, pond water and something chemical, like chlorine mixed with rust. I grabbed my CB and tried to call out to any other drivers, asked if anyone else had seen the woman on the Riverside overpass, but all I got back was this weird feedback, a high-pitched whine that made me yank the handset away from my ear. Through my mirrors, I watched that overpass shrink behind me, but I could still make out her white figure up there, now turned completely around, still watching my truck disappear into the fog. I told myself it was probably someone having a mental health crisis, maybe escaped from a hospital, and I should call 911, but my phone showed no signal, which was impossible because I'd just been streaming a podcast 20 minutes earlier. About 3 miles down the road, the fog got thicker, if that was even possible. My high beams were useless, just reflecting back at me off that white wall, so I dropped down to regular headlights and slowed to about 50. The engine was running rough, missing occasionally, which made no sense because I'd just had it serviced in Chicago 2 days before. Then my dashboard lights started flickering. Not all of them, just the ones on the right side, creating this strobe effect that made it hard to read my gauges. I was reaching for my phone to try calling dispatch when I saw something in the road ahead, right in the center of my lane. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe debris that had fallen off another truck, but as I got closer my whole body went rigid. It was her, the same woman from the overpass, standing perfectly still in the middle of the highway, facing me with her arms hanging straight down at her sides. That white gown now completely motionless despite the wind I could hear howling outside my cab. I hit the brakes hard, probably too hard for a fully loaded rig. The trailer started to fishtail, and I could hear my cargo shifting, metal grinding against metal as 40,000 pounds of automotive parts fought against the sudden deceleration. The anti-lock system kicked in, that violent juddering that shoots up through the pedal and into your whole leg, and I'm wrestling the wheel to keep from jackknifing while my headlights sweep across her figure. She never moved, never flinched, just stood there with her head tilted slightly to one side like she was listening to something only she could hear. Her feet were bare, I could see that now, standing on asphalt that had to be freezing cold, and there were dark stains running down her gown from the chest area. But here's what really got me. In that split second before I would have hit her, when I was maybe 10 feet away and could see her face clearly for the first time, her mouth was moving rapidly, like she was talking or screaming. But there was no sound coming out, just this frantic movement of her jaw and lips. Then nothing. My truck passed right through where she'd been standing. No impact, no thud, nothing under my wheels. I came to a full stop about 50 yards down the road, pulled onto the shoulder with my hazards going, and sat there trying to catch my breath. My chest felt like someone was sitting on it, and I could taste copper in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue during the panic stop. I grabbed my spotlight and checked my mirrors, swept the beam across the road behind me, but there was nothing there except swirling fog and empty asphalt. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 seconds, but every detail was burned into my brain. The way her collarbone jutted out through the thin fabric, the blue tinge to her lips, the way her fingers had been curled into claws at her sides. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes waiting for my heartbeat to return to normal, telling myself I'd been driving too long. That highway hypnosis and fog were playing tricks on me. Finally got myself together enough to keep driving, but I white-knuckled it the rest of the way to St. Louis, stopping at every rest area to splash water on my face and walk around my truck, checking for any damage that might explain what I'd experienced. The fog lifted just before dawn, right as I crossed into Missouri, and seeing that clear morning sky felt like coming up for air after being underwater. I made my delivery on time, barely, and grabbed breakfast at a truck stop diner where I must have drunk 6 cups of coffee trying to make sense of the night. The waitress, a woman named Dottie with kind eyes and a grandmother's way about her, asked if I was feeling all right because I looked pale as a sheet. I almost told her everything right then, but how do you explain something like that without sounding completely unhinged? Instead, I asked her if she'd heard anything about accidents on I-55 near Bloomington, maybe someone getting hit recently. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through local news but found nothing from the last few days. The return trip to Chicago was in broad daylight, and I made sure to take a different route, adding an extra hour just to avoid that stretch of I-55. But curiosity got the better of me when I stopped for fuel in Springfield. The kid working the register was a local, probably 19 or 20, with gauged ears and tattoos creeping up his neck. While he was ringing me up, I mentioned the Riverside Road overpass, asked if he knew anything about it. His whole demeanor changed. He stopped scanning my items and looked at me with this expression somewhere between pity and fear. He said locals don't talk about that overpass much, but truckers see her all the time, especially during foggy nights in spring and fall. Some woman had jumped from there back in 1994, he said, after her daughter died in a car accident on that same stretch of highway. The woman had been wearing her hospital gown when she jumped, having walked out of the psychiatric ward at Regional Medical Center just hours before. They found her body the next morning, but truckers had been reporting seeing her for years before anyone made the connection. The kid went on to tell me that the state had installed higher barriers on that overpass in 2008 and cameras in 2015, but the sightings never stopped. He pulled up something on his phone, showed me a trucker forum where drivers swap stories about that exact stretch of road. There were dozens of accounts, all describing the same woman in white, the same encounter pattern, first on the overpass, then in the road ahead. Some drivers claimed they'd swerved and crashed trying to avoid her, though the accident reports never mentioned seeing anyone. One post from a driver named Keith from Nebraska really stuck with me. He'd seen her 3 times over 15 years, always in the same spot, always the same sequence. He wrote that the 3rd time he just drove straight through without braking, and she vanished like smoke. But here's what made me go cold all over again. Keith's post was dated 2 weeks before his fatal accident on that same stretch of highway, when his truck went off the road in clear weather with no explanation. I couldn't stop thinking about it during my mandatory rest period at the hotel that night. I kept going over every detail, trying to find some logical explanation that didn't involve accepting what seemed impossible. Maybe there was something about that specific area, electromagnetic fields from power lines, some kind of gas leak that caused hallucinations, or just the perfect storm of fog, exhaustion, and suggestion. I even researched whether certain stretches of highway could create optical illusions, found some stuff about mirages and temperature inversions, but nothing that quite fit what I'd experienced. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I called my buddy Frank, who'd been driving that route for 25 years. When I started describing what happened, he cut me off mid-sentence. He knew exactly what I was talking about, had seen her himself back in 2009. But Frank said something that bothered me even more than the sighting itself. He said the ones who see her multiple times always end up having accidents on that road, not always fatal, but always bad enough to end their driving careers. It was like she was marking drivers somehow, he said, though he couldn't explain what he meant by that. For the next 3 months, I managed to avoid that route entirely, taking longer hauls that kept me away from central Illinois. The company dispatcher, a guy named Tony who'd been routing trucks since before I started driving, never questioned my sudden preference for northern routes, which made me wonder if he knew something. But in August, I got cornered into taking a rush delivery to Memphis, and the only way to make the deadline was straight down I-55. I told myself I'd be fine. It was a clear summer afternoon, no fog, perfect visibility. I even had another driver, a friend named Paul, riding along because his truck was in the shop. We were laughing about something stupid on the radio when we approached that overpass, but the laughter died in my throat when I saw her. Broad daylight, 3 p.m., cars everywhere, and there she was in the same spot, same position, same white gown. But this time, her face was turned up toward the sun, and I could see her features clearly. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under empty eyes, and a mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. Paul saw her too, grabbed my arm so hard he left bruises, kept saying, what the hell, over and over. We both saw her turn her head to follow our truck as we passed under. That was my last run on I-55. I switched companies 2 weeks later, took a pay cut to drive regional routes in Michigan, where the longest stretch of highway is maybe 2 hours. Paul quit driving altogether, went back to construction work despite his bad back. We never talked about what we saw after that day, but I heard from Tony that 3 more drivers had reported seeing her that same week in August, all in broad daylight, all describing the exact same details. The company quietly started routing newer drivers around that stretch, adding miles and hours to delivery times without explanation. The official word was construction delays, but there hasn't been any construction there in years. I still drive, still love the job most days, but sometimes when I'm passing under an overpass at night, especially when there's fog, I grip the wheel a little tighter and try not to look up. Whatever that woman was, ghost, hallucination, mass hysteria, or something else, she changed something fundamental about how I see the road. The highway isn't just asphalt and white lines anymore. It's a place where terrible things leave marks that won't fade. where trauma seems to replay itself for reasons none of us can understand. The thermometer on my dashboard read 116 degrees that September afternoon, and the Nevada desert stretched out ahead of me like an endless brown ocean. 8 years of driving 18-wheelers through this wasteland had taught me to respect the heat, but that particular day felt different, meaner somehow. My Peterbilt was loaded with construction materials bound for Las Vegas, and I was making good time on Highway 95, about 30 miles south of Tonopah. The AC struggled to keep up, blowing lukewarm air that barely cut through the oppressive temperature inside the cab. Radio reception had died about 20 minutes back, leaving me with nothing but engine noise and the hypnotic whine of tires on superheated asphalt. That stretch of road is notorious among truckers. 60 miles of nothing but Joshua trees, dried lake beds, and the occasional roadside memorial marking where someone's luck ran out. The isolation gets to you after a while, makes you start seeing things in the heat mirages that dance on the horizon. When I first spotted the figure walking along the shoulder, my brain refused to process it properly. Nobody walks out there, not in September, not in that kind of heat, not 30 miles from the nearest anything. But as my rig ate up the distance between us, the shape resolved into a young woman, maybe 22 or 23, trudging southbound with her head down. She wore faded jeans and a green t-shirt that had some indie band's logo peeling off the front, the Desert Ghosts or something like that. A worn canvas backpack bounced against her shoulders with each step, and her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that swayed as she walked. The strange thing was, she wasn't hitchhiking. Her thumb stayed down, arms hanging loose at her sides, like she was just out for an afternoon stroll instead of marching through hell itself. Company rules are clear about picking up hitchhikers. It's a firing offense. But watching her walk in that heat triggered something maternal in me. My own daughter, Katie, had just started her junior year at ASU, and the thought of her stranded out here made my foot ease off the accelerator. I pulled over about 50 yards ahead of her, hazards clicking in the sudden quiet after I killed the engine. Through my side mirror, I watched her approach. Same steady pace, no change in her stride, like she'd expected me to stop all along. When she reached the passenger door, she didn't knock or wave, just stood there looking up at me through the window. Her face was pale despite the desert sun, with these gray-green eyes that seemed too bright for how exhausted she should have been. No sweat on her forehead, no sunburn, nothing. That should have been my first warning, but I was too focused on doing what I thought was right. I leaned over and popped the door open, and she climbed up into the cab with surprising ease for someone who'd been walking in that heat. The leather seat creaked as she settled in, placing her backpack carefully between her feet like it contained something fragile. "Thanks," she said, and her voice had this odd quality to it. Not quite hoarse, but hollow somehow, like an echo in an empty room. She didn't offer her name or ask mine, just sat there staring straight ahead through the windshield. I pulled back onto the highway, building speed slowly to let the AC catch up. The cab filled with that awkward silence you get when strangers share a small space, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the whisper of cold air from the vents. I tried to make conversation, asked her where she was headed, but she just mumbled south and kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Her hands rested on her thighs, fingers splayed out flat against the denim, and I noticed her nails were painted this chipped purple color that reminded me of desert lupines. The smell in the cab changed too, not unpleasant exactly, but different, like sage and dust and something else I couldn't place, something that made me crack my window despite the heat outside. We drove like that for maybe 10 minutes, the speedometer holding steady at 65 while the mile markers ticked by. I kept glancing at her in my peripheral vision, trying to figure out what felt so wrong about the whole situation. She never shifted position, never adjusted the air vent pointed at her face, never reached for the water bottle I'd offered. Just sat there like a mannequin, barely even blinking. The GPS showed we were coming up on Goldfield in about 40 miles, and I figured I'd drop her there, let her find another ride or catch a Greyhound. But then she moved for the first time since getting in, turning her head slowly to look out the passenger window. We were passing one of those roadside memorial crosses. White wood bleached even whiter by the sun, plastic flowers faded to gray, somebody's name on a small metal plaque that I couldn't read at highway speed. They're all over Nevada highways, marking spots where accidents happened, where somebody's story ended. "Pull over," she said suddenly, her voice sharper than before. It wasn't a request. I eased off the gas, confused, thinking maybe she was sick or needed to use the bathroom, though there was nothing but desert for miles. But she was leaning forward now, pressing her palm flat against the window, staring at that memorial cross as we rolled past it. "Please," she added, and something in her tone made me hit the brakes harder than I intended. The truck shuddered to a stop about 100 yards past the memorial, gravel crunching under the tires. She had her hand on the door handle before we'd even stopped completely, and I watched in my mirror as she climbed down and started walking back toward the cross. The heat hit me through the open door like a physical force, and I could see the air shimmering around her as she moved. I put the truck in park and followed her, partly out of concern, and partly because something about this whole thing had my nerves singing like power lines. She stopped right in front of the memorial, standing so still she could have been another desert monument. The cross itself was nothing special, 2 pieces of wood wired together, weathered and splitting at the edges. The plastic flowers at its base had been there so long they'd turned the color of old bones. But it was the plaque that made my mouth go dry. Ashley Reeves, 1999 to 2023, forever young. The date hit me like ice water. September 15th, 2023. Exactly 1 year ago to the day. The girl, Ashley, I guess, knelt down and touched the plaque with one finger, tracing the letters of the name like she was reading Braille. The wind picked up suddenly, sending dust devils spinning across the highway, and her ponytail whipped around her face. She looked up at me then, and those gray-green eyes had gone almost transparent in the late afternoon sun. "I was going home," she said, her voice so quiet I almost missed it. "Heading back to Vegas after visiting my boyfriend in Reno." The other driver was texting, crossed the center line doing 70. I stood there trying to process what she was saying, the rational part of my brain scrambling for explanations. Maybe she was a sister, a friend, someone who knew Ashley and was grieving in her own strange way. People deal with trauma differently, and the desert can mess with your head even on good days. But then she stood up and turned to face me fully, and I noticed things I should have seen before. Her green t-shirt had a tear across the stomach, edges darkened with something that looked rust-colored in the fading light. The left side of her face, which had been turned away from me in the truck, had a pattern of fine scratches running from temple to jaw. Not fresh ones. They looked healed over, silvery like old scars, but they hadn't been there when she first got in. Or had they? The heat was making everything wobble and blur, and I couldn't trust what I was seeing anymore. "That's where I died," she said, pointing at the spot where the memorial stood. "Right there where the gravel meets the asphalt. My car rolled 3 times. They said I was gone before the paramedics arrived." The words hung in the desert air between us, impossible and undeniable at the same time. I took a step backward, instinctively, and felt the heat from the asphalt seeping through my boot soles. Every horror story I'd heard from other truckers at rest stops and diners came flooding back. Tales I'd always laughed off as highway folklore and too many caffeine pills. But here I was, standing on the side of Highway 95 with a girl who claimed to be dead, and the evidence was stacking up in ways I couldn't explain away. "You need help," I heard myself saying, though the words came out shaky. "There's a hospital in Goldfield, or we could call someone." But she was already shaking her head, that ponytail swaying like a pendulum. "I just needed to see it again," she said. "Every year on this day I try to make it back here. Sometimes people stop, sometimes they don't. You're the 3rd one to actually follow me to the cross." She reached down and adjusted one of the plastic flowers that had fallen over, her movements careful and deliberate, like she was tending a garden. I wanted to run back to my truck, lock the doors, and drive away fast enough to convince myself this never happened. But something kept me rooted there, watching her say goodbye to her own memorial. She stood up slowly, brushing invisible dust off her jeans, and looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. "I should go," she said. "You've been kind. Kinder than most." She started walking back toward the truck, and I followed a few steps behind, my mind racing through rational explanations. Heat stroke, elaborate prank, mental breakdown, hers or mine. But when we reached the Peterbilt, she stopped at the passenger side and looked up at me one more time. "Drive safe," she said, "and maybe don't pick up any more hitchhikers today." I blinked, just once, a normal blink, fraction of a second, and the space where she'd been standing was empty. No footprints in the gravel, no shadow moving across the desert. The passenger door was closed, though I hadn't heard it shut. I climbed back into my cab with legs that felt like water, fumbling with my seatbelt like I'd forgotten how buckles worked. The seat where she'd been sitting showed no indentation in the leather, no warmth from a body that had been there just minutes ago. But that smell lingered, sage and dust and something else, stronger now. I grabbed my phone from the center console, hands trembling as I Googled Ashley Reeves Nevada car accident 2023. The signal was weak, but the search loaded eventually. Third result down, a news article from the Tonopah Times-Bonanza. Young woman killed in head-on collision on Highway 95, September 15, 2023. The other driver survived with minor injuries. There was a photo, the same gray-green eyes, the same dark hair, though styled differently. Ashley Marie Reeves, aged 23, originally from Las Vegas. The article mentioned she'd been visiting her boyfriend, Brandon, in Reno, and was driving home when the accident occurred. Every detail matched what she'd told me, down to the other driver texting. My stomach churned as I read the last line. Reeves was pronounced dead at the scene after her vehicle rolled multiple times. I sat there for another 20 minutes, engine idling, watching the sun sink toward the mountains and paint everything orange and red. Other vehicles passed occasionally, a few cars, another semi, an RV with bikes strapped to the back, but none of them slowed near the memorial. Finally, I put the truck in gear and continued south, driving slower than usual, checking my mirrors constantly. The rest of the trip to Vegas felt like moving through a dream. I delivered my load, grabbed a motel room, and didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called my dispatcher and requested a different route. Been driving the eastern corridors ever since, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. But every September 15th, no matter where I am, I think about Ashley Reeves standing by that cross. I've never told anyone at work, obviously, but sometimes at truck stops, I hear other drivers mention Highway 95. They talk about a young woman walking alone in the heat, about picking up a quiet passenger near Tonopah. They always end the same way, looking back to find an empty seat. I just nod and change the subject. Some things you carry alone, even if you're not the only one carrying them. "23 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler teaches you things about the road that most people never learn." February 2022 was just another month of hauling loads across state lines, another month of truck stops and weigh stations, another month of keeping America moving. At 51, with a bad knee from an old loading dock injury and a photo of my kids taped to the dashboard, I was just trying to make my miles and get home safe. That particular night, I was running furniture from Louisville down to Nashville, taking Highway 31E through the Kentucky countryside. The route takes you through some lonely stretches, especially that section between Bardstown and Hodgenville, where civilization thins out and the woods crowd right up to the asphalt. Around 2 a.m., with nothing but darkness beyond my headlights and static crackling on the CB, I was making good time. My thermos was still warm, the heater was humming, and I figured I'd hit Nashville right on schedule for my morning delivery. My high beams picked him up from about a quarter mile out, just a shape at first, walking along the shoulder in the same direction I was heading. As I got closer, the details filled in. Young guy, couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, wearing this thin denim jacket that made me cold just looking at it. The temperature gauge on my dash showed 34 degrees outside. He had his arm out, thumb up, that universal gesture every trucker knows. Company rules are clear about passengers. It's a fireable offense. Insurance liability, safety concerns, all that corporate stuff. But seeing this kid out there miles from the nearest town, no cell phone light in his hand, just walking in the freezing dark, something made me ease off the accelerator. I pulled over about 50 yards past him, watching in my side mirror as he started jogging toward the cab, his breath making white puffs in the night air. He climbed up and pulled the door open, and I got my first good look at him in the dome light. Clean-shaven, sandy brown hair that hung a little long over his ears, and these pale gray eyes that seemed almost silver in the overhead light. "Thanks for stopping," he said, and his voice had this soft Kentucky drawl, polite as could be. "Name's Jimmy. Just need to get up near the old Whip-Poor-Will Bridge if you're going that far." I knew the bridge, about 15 miles ahead, an old concrete thing that crossed Salt River. I told him to hop in, that I'd be passing right by it. He settled into the passenger seat with this quiet sigh, like he'd been walking for hours. The cab filled with the smell of cold air and something else, kind of musty, like damp leaves or old basement corners. I cranked the heater up a notch and pulled back onto the highway, checking my mirrors for any traffic behind us. We rode in silence for a few minutes while he warmed up. I offered him some coffee from my thermos, but he shook his head, just stared out at the road ahead. Finally, I asked him what he was doing out here at this hour. No car, no nothing. He turned to look at me, and in the green glow of the dashboard, his face looked almost translucent, tired beyond his years. "Car broke down," he said simply. "Been trying to get home. My folks live just past the bridge, up on Carpenter Road. Been walking for hours, figured nobody would stop this late." Made sense, I guess, though something about it nagged at me. No broken down car on the shoulder that I'd seen. No hazard lights anywhere. But highways are long, and maybe he'd been walking for miles already. I asked if he wanted to use my phone to call someone, let them know he was okay. He just smiled, this small, sad smile, and said, "They're not expecting me. Want to surprise them." The miles rolled by under my wheels and Jimmy stayed quiet, just watching the darkness flow past his window. Every now and then, I'd glance over at him. He never moved much, just sat there with his hands folded in his lap, fingers interlaced like he was praying or deep in thought. The heater was blowing full blast now, but he never unzipped that denim jacket, never complained about being hot. I tried to make conversation, asked about his car, what kind it was, where exactly it broke down. His answers came slow, vague. "Old Ford," he'd say, "few miles back." When I asked what was wrong with it, he just shrugged and said, "Engine trouble. Always had engine trouble." The way he talked about it, present tense but also past, like he was confused about when things happened. I figured maybe he was just exhausted, disoriented from walking in the cold for so long. About 10 miles from the bridge, things got strange. Not supernatural strange, just wrong. I reached for my coffee, and when I looked back at the road, Jimmy was turned sideways in his seat, staring right at me. Not aggressively, not threateningly, just watching with those pale eyes that barely blinked. "You ever lose someone?" he asked suddenly. The question came out of nowhere, made me uncomfortable. I told him sure, everyone loses people eventually. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I mean really lose them. Like 1 second they're there and the next they're just gone. No goodbye, no last words, just gone." His voice had this hollow quality to it, like an echo in an empty room. I mumbled something about how that must be hard, trying to keep things light, professional. But he kept staring, kept talking. "The bridge," he said. "That's where it happened, where everything changed." "You know about the bridge?" I told him I'd driven over it plenty of times, nothing special about it. He turned back to face forward, and I swear the temperature in the cab dropped 10 degrees. 5 miles from Whippoorwill Bridge, and I was counting every one of them. Jimmy had gone silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Heavy, expectant. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. I remember that specifically because I kept checking it, wondering how time seemed to be crawling. The road was empty except for us, just my headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional reflective marker flashing by. Then Jimmy started talking again, but not to me. He was mumbling, having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. I know, he'd say. Almost there. Almost home. I asked who he was talking to, and he looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there. Nobody, he said, just thinking out loud. But he kept doing it, these half-whispered responses to questions only he could hear. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Everything in my gut was screaming that something was wrong with this whole situation. But what was I going to do? Kick him out on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere? The bridge finally came into view, just a dark shape against the slightly lighter sky. Old concrete and steel. Nothing remarkable except for how isolated it was. No houses nearby, no lights. Just woods on both sides. Jimmy sat up straighter, leaning forward like a dog that knows it's almost home. "Right here," he said, his voice urgent now. "Pull over right before the bridge. This is perfect." I eased the truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. Before I'd even come to a complete stop, Jimmy had his hand on the door handle. "Thanks," he said, and for the first time since he'd gotten in, he smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "You don't know what this means. Getting back here, getting home." He pushed the door open, and the dome light came on. I turned to grab my logbook to note the stop, company habit, and when I looked back, the passenger door was swinging closed. But Jimmy wasn't walking away from the truck. He wasn't anywhere. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to process what just happened. The dome light had gone off when the door closed, leaving me in darkness except for the dashboard glow. I grabbed my flashlight from the side pocket and jumped out, scanning the area around the truck. Nothing. No footprints in the gravel, no figure walking toward the woods. No Jimmy. The air outside was bitter cold and absolutely still, not even wind in the trees. I walked around the entire truck twice, checked underneath with the flashlight, even looked up at the sleeper cab thinking maybe somehow he'd climbed up there, but there was nowhere he could have gone in those 2 seconds I'd looked away. The woods were at least 20 feet from where I'd parked, and the bridge was another 30 feet ahead. A person can't just vanish. My mind was racing through rational explanations. Maybe he'd dropped down on the far side of the truck and crawled into the woods. But why would anyone do that? I stood there by the bridge for another 10 minutes, calling out, "Jimmy!" into the darkness, feeling increasingly foolish and unnerved. The only sound was my truck engine rumbling and this weird creaking from the old bridge, metal contracting in the cold. Finally, I climbed back into the cab, locked both doors, something I never do when I'm driving, and sat there trying to make sense of it. The passenger seat still had an indentation where he'd been sitting. That musty smell lingered in the air. But the strangest thing, the seat wasn't warm. I touched it with my palm and it was cold as ice, like nobody had been sitting there at all. I drove across that bridge doing about 20 miles per hour, windows down despite the cold, searching for any sign of him. Nothing. Just empty road and dark woods. I didn't stop again until I hit a well-lit truck stop 40 miles down the highway. At the truck stop, I needed answers. My mind wouldn't let it go. I found myself at the counter, ordering coffee I didn't want just to talk to the waitress, a woman named Darlene according to her name tag. Gray-haired, probably in her 60s, the kind who'd been working truck stops since before I started driving. I asked her about Whippoorwill Bridge, trying to sound casual. Her face changed immediately. Not scared, but knowing, like she'd heard this before. "You gave someone a ride, didn't you?" she asked, and the coffee cup rattled when I set it down. She leaned in closer, voice dropping. "Young man? Denim jacket? Wanted to go to the bridge? I just nodded, couldn't find words. Darlene sighed and pulled out her phone, showed me a faded newspaper article from 1978. Jimmy Garrett, she said, died when his truck jackknifed on black ice right at that bridge. 22 years old, been 44 years now, and drivers still pick him up. Always the same. Walking alone, needs to get to the bridge, disappears when they get there. I read that article 3 times, staring at the grainy photo of a young man who looked exactly like my passenger. Same sandy hair, same pale eyes, even the same denim jacket. The article said he'd been driving home to surprise his parents for his mother's birthday when he lost control. Died on impact. Darlene patted my arm and said I wasn't crazy, wasn't the first, wouldn't be the last. Other truckers at the counter nodded, and one guy said he'd had the same thing happen in 2015. Another claimed his brother picked up Jimmy in 2008. They all had the same story. Cold seat, sudden disappearance, that musty smell. The rational part of my brain kept saying this was impossible, some kind of local legend everyone was in on. But I knew what I'd experienced. That was no prank, no hitchhiker running off into the woods. I finished my route, delivered the furniture, but I've never taken Highway 31E again. I go the long way now, adding an hour to my trip. Because I know Jimmy's still out there, still trying to get home, and I can't bear to see him again, knowing he'll never make it. Four months ago, I was hauling a load of frozen goods from Houston to San Antonio. Something I'd been doing for about 8 years since I got my CDL. The trucking life suited me just fine. Decent money, independence, and I actually enjoyed the solitude of those long Texas highways at night. I was 34, divorced, no kids, and honestly preferred the company of my CB radio buddies to most people I knew in real life. That particular night in early March started like any other run, checking my rig at the depot, grabbing a thermos of black coffee, and hitting the road around 11 p.m. to avoid the morning traffic. The weather was clear, just a slight breeze coming in from the Gulf, and I remember thinking it was one of those perfect nights for driving, where you could see every star in that big Texas sky. Highway 281 between Blanco and Johnson City was a route I knew well, but I always stayed alert through that particular stretch because other drivers had warned me about it over the years. They called it Robbery Alley on the CB channels, said there'd been problems with hijackings going back decades, trucks getting forced off the road and robbed of their cargo. Thing about that section of 281 is that it's isolated. Lots of curves and hills, barely any cell service, and the few ranch roads that branch off lead to nothing but darkness and cattle gates. I kept my doors locked, maintained a steady speed around 65, and always had my phone charging in case I needed to call 911 quickly. That night, I'd just passed mile marker 42 when I noticed headlights in my mirrors, coming up fast behind me, which wasn't unusual. But then they started flashing their high beams repeatedly, the universal signal that something's wrong. The vehicle pulled alongside me and I could make out it was an old pickup truck, maybe from the 70s, one of those Ford F-150s with the round headlights and that boxy shape they used to have. The driver was waving frantically out his window, pointing at my trailer like something was seriously wrong back there. Maybe a door swinging open or a tire about to blow. Now I'd heard every trick in the book about how hijackers operate. They get you to stop by pretending there's an emergency, then they rob you blind once you're out of the cab. But this guy seemed genuinely panicked, not aggressive, and he kept falling back behind me, then speeding up alongside again, still waving and pointing. I couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, just the outline of what looked like a baseball cap and a plaid shirt. But something about his desperation made me ease off the accelerator just a bit, though I sure as hell wasn't planning to stop completely. Grabbed my CB and tried channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, calling out for anyone else on this stretch who might be able to verify what this pickup driver was seeing. Breaker, breaker. This is Ice Queen northbound on 281 near mile 42. Got a four-wheeler trying to flag me down? Anyone got eyes on my 6? Nothing but static came back, which was strange because usually there's at least some chatter, even at that hour. The pickup was still beside me. Now the driver was honking his horn in short bursts. 3 quick honks, pause, 3 more, like some kind of code. I checked all my mirrors, my gauges. Everything looked normal from where I sat. Tire pressure good, engine temperature fine, no warning lights on the dash. But this guy wouldn't give up, and now he was slowing down, falling back again. And I watched in my mirror as his headlights started to fade, getting dimmer and dimmer, even though he couldn't have been more than 50 feet behind me. Then the strangest thing happened. Those headlights just disappeared completely, like someone had switched them off, except there was nowhere for that truck to go. The road behind me was straight for at least a quarter mile. No exits, no shoulders wide enough to pull off. Just guardrails and a steep drop into scrub brush on both sides. I actually hit my brakes a little, thinking maybe the guy had crashed or something, but when I looked back again, there was absolutely nothing there. No taillights disappearing into the distance, no dust cloud from a vehicle leaving the road, just empty asphalt lit up by the red glow of my own trailer lights. My first thought was that maybe he'd turned his lights off completely and was following me in the dark, which would be insane on that winding road. But I would have still seen the shape of the truck blocking the stars or something. I kept checking my mirrors every few seconds for the next 5 miles, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for those headlights to suddenly reappear right on my bumper. By the time I reached the truck stop at the junction of 281 and Route 290, I was wound up tighter than a spring, sweating through my shirt even though the AC was blasting. The parking lot was well lit with those harsh sodium lights, and there were a few other rigs there, which made me feel safer immediately. I pulled in, did a complete walk around of my trailer with my flashlight, checking every inch, every tire, every lock, every seal on the doors. Everything was perfectly fine. Nothing wrong at all. Inside the truck stop, I bought a cup of coffee I didn't need and struck up a conversation with the night clerk, a woman named Gloria, who looked like she'd been working there since the place was built. When I mentioned the weird encounter with the pickup truck near mile marker 42, she stopped counting the register and looked at me with this expression I'll never forget, like she was trying to decide whether to tell me something or just let it go. "Honey," she finally said, leaning across the counter, "you're about the 20th driver this year who's told me that exact same story about that exact same spot." Gloria poured herself a coffee and told me what she knew, speaking in that matter-of-fact Texas drawl that made everything sound both casual and deadly serious at the same time. According to her, back in 1987, there was an attempted hijacking at that exact location, right around mile marker 42, where the road curves and dips into a little valley. A family of 4 in a pickup truck, husband, wife, and 2 teenage boys, had tried to warn a trucker about a group of hijackers who'd set up a fake accident scene just ahead. The family had been driving home from Austin when they'd come across the setup and realized what it was, so they'd turned around to warn oncoming trucks. But the hijackers had backup vehicles, and when they saw the family trying to interfere, they went after them. The pickup was run off the road into a ravine, and all 4 people died on impact. The trucker they'd been trying to warn got away when he heard the crash and gunned it through the fake accident scene, later reporting everything to the state police. What Gloria told me next made every hair on my arm stand straight up. She said that at least 2 or 3 times a month, truckers stop at her station with the same story, an old 70s Ford pickup trying desperately to warn them about something, the driver waving and honking, always at that same spot, always disappearing without a trace. Some drivers, the ones who actually stopped, reported finding fresh tire marks on the road, like vehicles had been positioned to block the highway just minutes before, but by the time they called it in, there was never any evidence of attempted hijacking. Other drivers found broken glass, flares that were still warm, or sometimes drag marks on the asphalt like heavy equipment had been moved quickly. The state police increased patrols through there for a while, but they never caught anyone in the act, and officially they treat the whole thing as urban legend mixed with driver fatigue. But Gloria had been keeping her own informal count for 15 years, and she said the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Always late at night, always lone trucks carrying valuable cargo. Always that same warning from a pickup that shouldn't exist. I sat there in that truck stop until dawn, nursing cold coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened to me. Gloria introduced me to another driver named Eugene, who'd had the same experience just 3 weeks earlier. He was hauling electronics from Dallas, and he said the pickup had appeared so suddenly in his mirrors that he'd nearly jackknifed trying to avoid it. But here's what really got me. Eugene had actually stopped about a mile past where the truck disappeared, and he'd found something. There were 3 flares laid out across the road in a triangle pattern, still smoking, and what looked like fresh oil spilled in a way that would cause any vehicle hitting it at speed to lose control. He'd called 911, waited 40 minutes for a sheriff's deputy to arrive, but by then someone had come back and cleaned everything up. The deputy found some residue and took photos, but without any crime actually committed, there wasn't much to investigate. Eugene believed that whoever was setting these traps had spotters, and when they saw him stop instead of driving through, they aborted and cleaned up their setup. The more I thought about it, the more it made a sick kind of sense. Maybe there really were hijackers still working that stretch, descendants or copycats of the ones from 1987, and maybe they'd gotten smarter, more careful. They set up, wait for a target, but if anything goes wrong, if the driver stops too early, calls for help, or if there's unexpected traffic, they vanish and try again another night. The pickup truck warnings could be anything. Mass hallucination, some kind of optical illusion caused by the landscape, or hell, maybe even someone who knows about the hijacking attempts trying to warn drivers in a way that can't be traced back to them. Gloria mentioned that a local ranch hand had once suggested it might be someone with a guilty conscience, maybe someone forced to participate in the hijackings who found a way to warn victims without getting caught by their partners. But that didn't explain how the truck just disappeared into nothing, unless there was some hidden turnoff everyone missed, or some kind of visual trick with the hills and curves that made it seem like the truck vanished when it actually just dropped out of sight. I never did figure out what really happened that night, but I changed my route after that. Started taking I-35 instead, even though it added an hour to my drive and meant dealing with more traffic. The company didn't question it when I put in the request, and later I found out I wasn't the first driver to refuse that stretch of 281. About a month after my experience, I heard through the CB network that they'd finally caught someone. A group of 3 men who'd been setting up fake construction zones to rob trucks. They'd been using stolen highway department equipment and uniforms, making everything look official. The arrests happened near Blanco, not far from mile marker 42, and the police found evidence linking them to at least 12 attempted hijackings over the past 2 years. But here's the thing that still keeps me up sometimes. The news report said they'd only been operating since 2016, and their method was completely different from what Eugene had described finding. No oil slicks or flares, just fake construction barriers and men with guns. I still drive trucks, still love the job, but I've learned to trust my gut and the warnings that come from nowhere. Whether that pickup was some kind of echo from the past, a guardian angel, or just someone who knew what was coming and tried to help, I'm grateful for it. Gloria from the truck stop called me about 6 months later to tell me the sightings were still happening, even after those arrests. Same pickup, same spot, same desperate attempts to warn drivers. She said a driver had actually gotten dashboard camera footage of the truck appearing and disappearing, but the video was too dark and grainy to prove anything except that something was there, and then it wasn't. I don't have an explanation that makes complete sense, and I've stopped trying to find one. All I know is that on that night in March, something tried to warn me about danger ahead, and I'm glad I paid attention, even if I didn't fully stop. Sometimes that's all we get in this life. Warnings we don't understand from sources we can't explain, and the choice to listen or keep driving into whatever's waiting in the dark. Most folks don't believe me when I tell them what happened during my haul through the desert last April. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing myself. But then I remember the police reports, the missing driver, and those long, empty hours on that godforsaken highway. I was hauling a load of restaurant equipment from Albuquerque to Phoenix, a route I'd done maybe 50 times before. 28 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, and I thought I'd seen everything the road had to offer. Drunk drivers swerving across lanes, folks falling asleep at the wheel, even a couple trying to hijack my cargo once outside Flagstaff. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered on Highway 60 that Thursday afternoon. The sun was beating down hard on the asphalt, making those heat mirages dance on the horizon, and I had another 6 hours of driving ahead of me. It was around 2 p.m. when I first noticed the sedan in my mirrors. Nothing special about it at first glance, just a dark blue four-door, maybe a Camry or an Accord, hard to tell from that distance. The thing that caught my attention was how it maintained the exact same distance behind me, like it was attached by an invisible rope. Now, I've been tailed before by cops running plates, by road ragers I might have accidentally cut off, even by lonely drivers who just want to follow someone through unfamiliar territory. But this was different. The car stayed exactly 3 truck lengths behind me, never gaining, never losing ground, even when I changed speeds. I'd slow down to 55, and there it would be, 3 lengths back. I'd push it up to 75, same exact distance. After about 40 miles of this, I started getting that crawling sensation in my gut, the kind you get when something just isn't right. I tried all the usual tricks to shake a tail, pulled off at a rest stop near Camado, pretended to check my tires, walked around the rig real slow. The sedan pulled into the lot too, parked way at the back near the restrooms. Nobody got out. I could barely make out the shape of someone behind the wheel through the tinted windows, but they just sat there, engine running. When I got back on the highway 10 minutes later, I watched my mirrors, hoping they'd stayed behind. But sure enough, 2 minutes after I merged back onto 60, there they were again, sliding into position exactly 3 truck lengths back. The windows were tinted just dark enough that I couldn't see who was driving, couldn't even tell if it was a man or woman. I grabbed my CB radio and asked if any other drivers could see the blue sedan behind me. Got a couple responses from truckers heading the opposite direction, but nobody behind me close enough to confirm what I was seeing. By the time I hit the town of Pie Town, yeah, that's a real place, I'd been watching this car for nearly 2 hours straight. My eyes were getting tired from checking the mirrors every few seconds, and my neck was starting to ache from the constant turning. I decided to try something else. There's this old trucker's trick where you gradually slow down on an uphill grade, force whoever's behind you to either pass or reveal their intentions. We were climbing into the Datal Mountains. Perfect opportunity. I let my speed drop to 40, then 35, hazards blinking. Any normal driver would have passed me by now, maybe honked their horn or flipped me off. But that sedan just slowed right down with me, maintaining that same exact distance like we were connected by a steel cable. That's when I really started to worry. My wife always jokes that I'm too stubborn to admit when I'm scared, but I'll tell you straight, I was getting scared. I pulled out my phone, yeah, I know, shouldn't use it while driving, but this was an emergency, and called the state patrol. The dispatcher who answered sounded bored at first, probably used to truckers calling in about aggressive drivers. But when I explained that this car had been following me for over 100 miles, maintaining the exact same distance no matter what I did, her tone changed. She asked for my location, mile marker 89 heading west, and said she'd send a trooper to intercept. She also asked me to describe the vehicle again, took down my truck's information, and told me to keep driving normally, not to stop for any reason. About 20 minutes later, I saw the trooper's lights in my mirrors, coming up fast in the left lane. I watched him pass me, then slow down between me and the sedan. This is where things get really weird, and I swear on my mother's grave I'm not making this up. The trooper pulled behind the sedan, lights still flashing, but the sedan didn't pull over. It just kept driving, same speed, same distance behind me. The trooper stayed behind it for maybe 2 miles, then suddenly sped up, passed both the sedan and my truck, and pulled me over instead. I was confused as hell, but I pulled onto the shoulder like he signaled. The trooper, young guy with a thick mustache, walked up to my window with this strange look on his face like he'd seen a ghost or something. He asked me if I was feeling all right, if I'd been driving long, if maybe I needed to rest. I told him I was fine, just spooked by that car that had been following me. He looked at me for a long moment, then said something that made my whole body go cold. He said he'd been behind me for the last 5 miles and there was no other vehicle between us. No blue sedan, no car of any kind. He'd checked the highway cameras from the dispatch center too, going back 2 hours. Every single frame showed my truck driving alone. No vehicles following me at all, but I could still see it. Right there in my mirror, 3 truck lengths back, waiting on the shoulder behind us. The trooper made me take a breathalyzer test right there on the side of the road. Came back clean, obviously. I hadn't touched a drop in 15 years, not since my daughter was born. He checked my logbook, looked at my pupils with a flashlight, even made me walk a straight line. The whole time I kept glancing back at that sedan, just sitting there, engine idling. Driver hidden behind those dark windows. The trooper couldn't see it, kept asking what I was looking at. Finally, he suggested I might be suffering from highway hypnosis. Said it happens to long-haul drivers sometimes, especially on these straight desert roads where everything looks the same for hours. He recommended I stop at the next town, get a room, rest up. But he also did something that struck me as odd. He called in my report anyway, filed it officially, and gave me a case number. Said if anything else unusual happened, I should call immediately and reference that number. As he walked back to his cruiser, he paused and looked back down the empty highway behind us, squinting like maybe, just maybe, he saw something too. I got back in my truck, and sure enough, when I pulled out, the sedan pulled out too. Same distance, same steady pace. But now I was really rattled. If the cameras couldn't see it, if the trooper couldn't see it, what the hell was I looking at? I started thinking maybe I was losing it. Maybe all those years on the road had finally caught up with me. But the thing is, I could see every detail of that car clear as day. The slight dent in the front bumper, the way one headlight sat a little lower than the other. Even caught a glimpse of some kind of air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror when the sun hit the windshield just right. You don't hallucinate details like that, do you? I kept driving, white-knuckling the steering wheel, checking my mirrors every few seconds. The sedan never wavered, never changed lanes unnecessarily, just followed with this unnatural precision that made my teeth hurt from clenching my jaw so hard. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. I tried everything to distract myself. Turned the radio up loud, called my wife. Didn't tell her what was happening, didn't want her to worry. Even sang along to some old Conway Twitty songs at the top of my lungs. But that sedan never left my mirrors. Around 5 p.m., the sun started getting low, shooting straight into my side mirrors and making it harder to see behind me. That's when I noticed something that made me pull off at the next exit, a little nothing town called Detil. The sedan's shadow. I could see its shadow stretching across the highway in the late afternoon sun, but when other cars passed by, their headlights went right through where the sedan should have been, like shining a flashlight through smoke. I parked at a small gas station, hands trembling as I filled up my tank. The sedan had pulled into the lot too, parked across from the pumps, just sitting there. I walked inside, bought a coffee I didn't want, and asked the kid behind the counter if he could see a blue sedan in the lot. He looked out the window, scanned the parking area, and shook his head. "Just my truck and an old pickup that belonged to a local," he said. I sat in that gas station for an hour, drinking bitter coffee and watching through the window. The sedan never moved, never turned off its engine. I could hear it idling, this low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The kid at the counter kept giving me worried looks, probably thought I was on something. Finally, I worked up the courage to walk toward it. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, my legs getting heavier the closer I got. When I was about 10 feet away, I could finally see through the driver's side window. There was someone in there. I was sure of it. But their features were all wrong, like looking at a face through frosted glass or heavy static. They weren't moving, weren't breathing that I could tell, just sitting there with their hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I reached out to tap on the window, and I swear the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My knuckles were an inch from the glass when my phone rang, making me jump back. It was dispatch from my company, asking why I'd stopped for so long. When I looked back, the sedan was gone. Not driving away, not pulling out, just gone, like it had never been there at all. I got back on the road, desperate to finish my run and get home. No more sedan in my mirrors, just normal traffic in the darkening desert. Made it to Phoenix by 9 p.m., delivered my load, and checked into a motel instead of heading back that night. Couldn't bring myself to drive that stretch of Highway 60 in the dark. I didn't sleep much, kept seeing those distorted features behind the frosted glass every time I closed my eyes. The next morning I took a different route home, adding 3 hours to my trip but avoiding that stretch of road completely. I filed my official report with the State Patrol using that case number, described everything in detail. The officer I spoke with seemed to take it seriously, said they'd had a few similar reports over the years but could never verify anything. Then she said something that made me sick to my stomach, asked if I'd heard about the Datil incidents. Apparently, 3 different drivers had gone missing on that exact stretch of Highway 60 over the past decade, all of them last seen at the same gas station where I'd stopped. All of them had called in reports of being followed by a vehicle that didn't show up on cameras. 6 days later, I saw the news report. Another trucker, a guy named Robert Vance from Oklahoma, had gone missing on Highway 60. His truck was found abandoned at that same gas station in Datil, engine still running, cargo untouched. The kid who worked at the station said Vance had come in acting agitated, kept asking about a car in the parking lot that wasn't there. Security footage showed him walking out to the lot, approaching an empty space, reaching out like he was about to touch something, and then just walking away. Not to his truck, not to the road, just walking straight out into the desert. They found his cell phone a mile out. Last message was to his dispatcher, "Following me again, going to make it stop." They never found him. State Patrol called me in for questioning, wanted to know if I'd seen anything else, if I had any idea what happened. I told them everything, but what could they do with that? I haven't driven that route since. Gave up a good contract, told my company I wouldn't haul through that part of the state anymore. Sometimes I wonder if that sedan is still out there, following some other poor bastard who thinks they're just tired, just seeing things. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving other routes, I still check my mirrors more than I should. Terrified I'll see that blue sedan exactly 3 truck lengths behind me. During that period, I was running long hauls mostly at night, hauling refrigerated goods across the Southwest. My name is Denise, and I'd been on the road for about 8 years by then, used to the loneliness and the rhythm of late-night trucking. I liked the quiet, the low hum of the engine, the steady sweep of headlights carving tunnels through the dark. That night, the route had me driving through endless desert stretches, where the horizon was flat and the sky felt wider than anywhere else in the country. I remember fueling up before leaving town, topping off my thermos with coffee, and telling myself it would be just another routine run. The CB radio was always on in my cab. Most of the time it stayed quiet unless another trucker chimed in with road updates or jokes to pass the miles. It had become like background noise, something I rarely paid attention to unless someone called my handle. But somewhere past midnight, when I was in the middle of a stretch of highway with no lights for miles, the static broke, and I heard a voice, low, almost a whisper, say my name. Not my handle, my actual name, spoken slowly, like it was being drawn out of the static itself. For a second I thought I was imagining it, maybe nodding off, but I was wide awake. At first I laughed to myself and said, "Yeah, right," out loud in the cab because there was no way anyone out there knew who I was by name. But then it came again, clearer this time, like 2 voices overlapping, both saying Denise at once. My grip on the steering wheel tightened and I turned down the music to make sure I wasn't mishearing. The whisper didn't come back right away, but when the radio hissed again, the voices said something different. "Slow down." The words were faint, but I caught them. and my body reacted before my mind did. I eased off the accelerator and started to coast. Not even a minute later, the voices pressed through the static again. "Stop now." My pulse kicked hard, and I pulled into the breakdown lane, convinced maybe there was a wreck ahead that I couldn't see yet. The road stretched dark and empty under my headlights, but I stayed there on the shoulder for several minutes, waiting. Nothing came. No cars, no trucks, no hazard lights in the distance. Just silence and the faint hum of desert wind outside my cab. I eventually pulled back onto the road, driving slower, scanning the pavement. But it was as if the warning had been for something that never happened. When I finally reached the next rest area, I pulled in just to stretch and shake off the weird feeling. The place was dimly lit, just a couple of trucks parked in a line, and the vending machines buzzing under a yellow lamp. I grabbed a soda, walked around the lot, and then leaned against my rig trying to calm down. A guy stepped out of his cab a few spots down and nodded at me. He was older, gray beard, cap pulled low, and when I mentioned I thought my CB was acting up, his expression shifted like he knew exactly what I was talking about before I finished. He asked, "Did it call your name?" And I swear my mouth went dry. I hadn't told him what I heard, only that something strange came through. He explained that a handful of drivers had heard whispers on that same stretch of highway. Sometimes it was their own names, sometimes it was warnings. The details varied, but every story had the same undercurrent, that the voices never came from any driver actually on the channel. It was like the CB was pulling words out of the air from nowhere. Another driver joined the conversation, a woman with her hair tied back in a messy bun, sipping from a travel mug. She said she'd been told about a massive crash years ago along that route, a pileup so bad that the CBs stayed active for hours even though the road was blocked. According to her, truckers who passed through afterwards swore they caught pieces of those last frantic transmissions, echoing again and again like a tape stuck on repeat. She shrugged, half smiling like it was a ghost story, but I could see she believed it more than she wanted to admit. I sat in my cab after that, engine idling, staring at the radio like it might come alive again. The night outside was thick with quiet, broken only by the hiss of air brakes from another truck pulling in. My coffee had gone cold, and the thought of getting back on that stretch made my chest tight. Eventually, I convinced myself I couldn't sit there forever. My delivery schedule wasn't going to wait. I started the next leg of the drive, but every mile after that felt like the desert itself was listening, waiting for me to hear those voices again. The road stretched quiet and empty for miles, the kind of silence that presses in on you harder than noise ever could. Every shadow along the shoulder looked like it was leaning closer, and the hum of my tires seemed louder than usual. I tried to distract myself with music, flipping stations, but the radio kept drifting back to static. I kept one eye on the CB, waiting, almost daring it to crackle again. Deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear those whispers, or if I was terrified that I would. It didn't take long. About an hour later, right in the middle of nowhere, the CB hissed to life, and the voices came back. Faint, layered, like more than one person speaking at once. "Exit ahead, don't take it," they murmured. My throat tightened. I glanced at the GPS, and sure enough, a small exit was coming up in less than a mile. Against every bit of logic, I stayed in the main lane and passed it. As soon as I cleared the ramp, headlights flickered in my mirror. A car shot down that exit at high speed, swerving so hard it nearly lost control before disappearing into the dark. By the time I reached the next town, I pulled into a truck stop and parked for the night. My nerves were fried, and I couldn't keep driving. Over a late plate of eggs at the diner counter, I asked the waitress if she ever heard stories about that stretch of road. She nodded, eyes shifting like she'd heard too many. She said older truckers still talked about the pileup years ago, the one that left radios buzzing for hours after. Some swore the dead never stopped trying to warn others, caught between channels, their last transmissions stuck in the air forever. I never heard those voices again after that trip, and I've hauled through that same desert more times than I can count. But every time I reach that stretch, I turn down the music, keep the CB on, and listen. Part of me thinks maybe the warning saved me from something I'll never fully understand. Another part believes those whispers belong to drivers who never made it home, their voices tangled in static, waiting to reach whoever will listen. Either way, that night changed the way I look at the road. Silence out there doesn't always mean you're alone. I'd been running long hauls for a few years when this happened. The kind of nights where the highway feels endless, and the world outside your cab is nothing but black fields and the occasional flicker of a farmhouse light. Back then, I drove a beat-up red Freightliner that rattled on certain stretches of road but never let me down. My routine was simple: coffee in the cup holder, CB radio humming low, and my logbook on the passenger seat. That night I was cutting across Nebraska, aiming to make it a few more hours before pulling into a rest area. The highway was unusually quiet, not a single set of headlights ahead or behind me for miles. It gave me that strange sense that I was the only one out there, like the world had folded in on itself. I remember fiddling with the CB just to hear another voice, anything to break the silence. The static was thick, sharp, and restless, but then it cut through with a man's voice, ragged and urgent. "Help! I need help at mile marker 212. My rig's overturned. Please." The transmission was broken, but the desperation in it was crystal clear. My first reaction was instinctive. I glanced at the dash clock. It was a little past 2 in the morning, and checked my own location. I wasn't far from that marker, maybe 10 minutes if I kept steady. Truckers look out for each other, and I didn't even question it. I clicked the mic, called back, but there was no response, just static hissing like a long exhale. I pressed harder on the pedal, the Freightliner growling as the empty road stretched ahead, my eyes scanning for taillights, reflective glass, anything that hinted at a wreck. When I finally rolled up to mile marker 212, I slowed down and craned my neck out the window. Nothing. No jackknife truck, no skid marks across the asphalt, not even a fragment of glass glittering under my headlights. The road was bare, smooth as if no tire had ever cut across it. I eased the truck onto the shoulder, hazard lights clicking, and stepped down onto the gravel. The night air was damp, carrying that smell of cut grass and diesel, but there wasn't another soul around. My flashlight beam wandered across the ditch, the posts, the marker itself, 212 painted clean and ordinary, until the silence pressed on me so hard it felt unnatural. I stayed there longer than I should have, walking the shoulder with my flashlight, calling out just in case someone had been thrown from the cab. The sound of my own boots crunching against the gravel felt too loud, echoing back in a way that made me uneasy. Every few seconds I'd lift the beam toward the tree line, half expecting to see a figure waving me down, but it was only empty branches swaying against the dark sky. When I finally climbed back into my truck, the CB hissed again, static snapping, followed by what sounded like the tail end of a groan. Then silence. I barely slept when I pulled into a rest stop hours later. The whole time my mind kept circling back to that voice. It had been too real to brush off as some kind of prank. By morning, I grabbed a coffee inside the diner and mentioned it to another driver sitting at the counter, a heavy-set guy with a salt and pepper beard who looked like he'd been hauling longer than I'd been alive. His face changed the moment I said, "Mile marker 212. He leaned in and told me about a crash that had happened years ago. A driver lost control in the rain, rig rolled, and the last transmission anyone ever heard was him begging for help at that exact marker." Hearing that sent a chill through me that no coffee could shake. I pressed for details, but the old-timer just shook his head like it wasn't the first time someone brought it up. According to him, there were stories of other truckers getting calls from that mile. Always the same desperate voice, always at night and always ending the same way, with nothing there. I sat there staring at my plate of eggs, untouched, while the diner chatter around me felt like it belonged to some other world. When I finally got back on the road, I slowed as I approached 212 again in daylight. Everything looked painfully ordinary. Flat land stretching forever, wild grass climbing the ditches, and the same metal sign standing crisp against the sky. But I couldn't shake the memory of that voice breaking through the static, the way it cut straight to something inside me. I rolled past it, but I swear the air felt heavier in that spot, like it remembered. For the rest of that run, I couldn't shake the habit of glancing at the CB every few minutes, waiting for the static to break again. Part of me dreaded hearing that voice, and another part almost expected it. Every time the radio hissed, I'd tense, bracing for those same desperate words. Nothing came through, though. Just the ordinary chatter of drivers calling out speed traps or weather warnings, like the road had gone back to being normal. Later that week, I mentioned it again at a truck stop in another state. A younger guy laughed it off, said I must have been half asleep. But an older woman sitting nearby leaned over and told me her husband swore he'd heard the same call a decade earlier. She said he stopped too, just like I did, and found nothing but silence at that marker. He never talked about it much after that, but she could tell it had gotten under his skin. That confirmed it wasn't just me. It wasn't just some trick of exhaustion or a wandering signal. I've been through Nebraska plenty of times since, but I never run that stretch without a knot forming in my chest as I get close to 212. I don't stop anymore, and I don't touch the CB when I'm passing through. The memory is enough, the tone of that voice, the way it cracked with panic like someone who still thought help might come if he called loud enough. It felt too human, too raw to be anything but real. Even now, years later, I can't explain it. Maybe it was an echo stuck in the airwaves, a ghost of a transmission replaying itself over and over. Or maybe there's something about that place that keeps dragging a man's final words back into the night. All I know is that I heard him, clear as if he'd been right there, and I'll never forget the weight of stopping at mile marker 212 with nothing but the sound of my hazards ticking against the emptiest road I've ever seen.